Happy Wednesday. Well, as you're going to see again here, I have a guest this time. I'm not doing this by myself. This is the continuation of my series where I talk to fellow creative types, mostly authors. And I got an awesome one lined up here, which I'm quickly going to introduce. Or better yet, I'll have you introduce yourself, Rob.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Rob Neto, and I've authored a few books so far, a nonfiction book and a couple of novels that have been published so far, plus another one just around the corner. What should I call you, Steve? I've seen some
Steve works
on there, and you said you've been called Grobs, Grobby.
Oh, well, yeah, no, actually, like I think it's fairly equal in my family. Some people say grub like you. Some people say grobe. I tend to fall on the grub schmidt part, but I don't correct anybody on that. The Steve part's what counts.
Steve, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's awesome. And I mean, just before I ask you a couple more questions, I mean, I think Rob is probably one of the first people I started following, kind of that first group when I got into Facebook about a year ago, the Facebook author page. And we've read each other's books. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, so I mean, for you, you mentioned you've written some books. You have a diving, like a rich diving background, and kind of have made like a big career out of that. And you've written some nonfiction in that space, but then you parlayed it into fiction. So how about just kind of talk about your diving background and kind of how that turned into creativity?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I started diving, I don't know, 21, 22 years ago. Shortly after I got married, my wife asked if I was interested in scuba diving, and I had been for a while, just never had the opportunity. So we kind of started on that endeavor together. And she's actually the one that got me into cave diving, believe it or not.
Cool.
I was more looking, into doing the shipwrecks and stuff like that. And but she had seen some photographs in National Geo showing some of the underwater caves here in Florida. And we had made a trip out to Florida one year, and we were mainly planning on doing some of the shipwrecks along the coast. Well, as luck would have it, we got stormed out for a couple of the days that we were supposed to dive. So we ended up coming inland to dive some of the freshwater springs, and I kind of got hooked at that point. I really fell in love with the springs and started off cave diving. We were still living in Arizona at the time, and we ended up within, I think, 3 years of getting certified. We moved out to Florida so we could be close to the caves. And a year later, I became a cave instructor, and it just kind of took off from there. And when I first got certified, my cave diving instructor, he knew that I had a background in literature. I taught some English classes at a couple of community colleges back in Arizona. And so he asked me if I was interested in writing an article for one of the cave diving training organizations for one of their quarterly journals. And I said, sure, why not? They wanted a perspective from someone kind of new to the activity. So I wrote out a 3-page long article and submitted it, and they went ahead and published it. And after that point, I was asked probably a couple of times a year if I had any other articles I wanted to submit. So that kind of started off the trend of just writing to that audience. And then in 2010, we had the fellow Ben McDaniel that went missing. He was diving over Vortex Spring, which is about an hour west of where I'm at. And I actually knew Ben. He had been one of my students, not a cave diving student. He had taken an entry-level technical diving class with me about 6 weeks before he disappeared. But I was one of the divers I was called out to go and search for his body inside the Vortex Spring.
Yeah.
Went in there, went all the way to the back of the cave, about 1,600 feet in. At that point, it gets too small for anyone to fit. And on the way back, checked a couple of offshoot passages. It's not a very extensive cave, 2 offshoot tunnels, and that's about it. And Ben's body wasn't in there. And several other divers went through there and looked for him over the following few weeks, and his body was never found. So, rumors obviously started to fly. Oh, he took off to Mexico, start a new life, or this or that. And one of the rumors was that he had actually died in there and his body was removed. And that's kind of what brought about the idea for Beyond the Great. And actually, I think it's a plausible explanation for his disappearance. And there's several other people. A friend of mine who is a police officer and specializes in search and recovery, dive operations. He kind of thinks that may be what happened. And even the family of Ben, they hired a private investigator, and one of the theories there was that he died in the cave and his body was removed. So that's where I went with the book. Obviously, there's some changes. I actually think that his body was buried somewhere in the woods in Florida, but of course that's not as exciting as having what happened in the book.
Yeah, keep it all in the water area.
Yeah. So I started writing that back then, probably about 2011, and then I got about halfway through and had writer's block. I just didn't know, and I think you had a similar thing with.
Yeah, it's funny. I think everybody I've talked to so far, we all started our first book like way further back than maybe some people realize. And for all the reasons you stop because you're discouraged, life comes up, whatever. But yeah, a long journey to get to the first one.
Yeah, that first one is just it's hell to get through. And then I had gone into a type of diving called side mount diving, where we mount our tanks on our sides. And I was one of the few instructors for that type of diving, and there were no resources out there. So I had written a lot of articles for those quarterly journals that focused on side mount diving. So I said, you know what, I'm going to take these, put them together, add some more information to it. I've got the foundation already, and I ended up putting together at that time, it was only about a 150-page book with a bunch of pictures and everything on side mount diving and learning how to side mount dive. And I published that in 2015. So that kind of took my attention for a while. And then after that, just life getting in the way and things to do.
Sure.
Finally, in 2020, I went back and did a second edition for my side mount diving book, which ended up being like double the length. It's about 300 pages, and published that. And I said, you know what? Beyond the Great's got to happen now. It's been sitting on the back burner for 10 years. And I pulled it out. I read through it. I said, it's not half bad. I made some edits to it, it made some improvements because I'd learned a lot in those past 10 years. And then suddenly the ending came to me, and I just knocked it out in probably about a month. And of course, the editing process took several more months.
Of course.
So that's how that started. And once that happened, the ideas just kept flowing, and I kept writing, and that was almost a year ago. It'll be a year in July 18th that book was published, and I'm about to publish my third novel, my fourth book, probably in August.
Nice. That seems to be a recurring theme. It's like it took us so long to do the first one, and I don't know if that just gave you confidence, but it's then all of a sudden you get the bug and you got to keep going. I mean, that's the same. Like it took me 20 some years to get my first book out, and then I knocked the next one out. Again, I wouldn't recommend this to people, but in a matter of months. And it's just, you just needed to decide. I don't know. You needed the oomph to go do it, I guess. Yeah, but for you, so like you had that, like the instructional books, like was there crossover in terms of your audience? I would imagine like people that knew you through that, like then tried your fiction book. Like how is the, how have the two interrelated, I guess, for you?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of my audience of my fiction work comes from my cave diving, because my cave diving notoriety, because I am somewhat well known in the cave diving community. I taught for 10 years I've got the side mount book, which is basically there are a couple of other side mount diving books out there, but none of them is quite as comprehensive as the one that I have. And you know, my side mount book's been translated into 3 other languages so far: German, Dutch, and Spanish. And right now we're working on a French translation, so it'll be available in 5 languages. And it's been sold all over the world. I mean, I've sold thousands of copies of that book all over the world. And so, yeah, that has definitely been a help in getting the fiction books out there and into people's hands as well. You know, I get a lot. I'll go into those Facebook scuba diving groups and cave diving groups and post about Beyond the Grade and Into the Darkness Beyond. And I'll have a sales spike over the next few days from people that are like, oh, look, a diving book I can read. That's why I think yesterday I sent you a message saying, hey, have you been on cyberpunk groups? Because I'm getting a lot of readers from my diving groups, and I think you could do the same thing from your cyberpunk groups.
Yeah, there's a surprisingly less amount than I would have thought, but I have been scouring more since you reminded me of it because yeah, I mean, that's how I've found so many books like in the genres. You just do like either you're searching based on the cyberpunk video game or whatever. But yeah, I imagine that if you can get yourself more visible on like a niche like that,
yeah,
because I would imagine there's not, you know, like I'm writing science fiction, cyberpunk. There's a lot of options out there, but like a book that has such a focus on like the diving aspect, even a fiction book, probably not a ton out there, right? Or are there? Yeah,
there are a few authors out there. There's some memoir type books. You know, Shadow Divers is one of the ones that comes to mind, where it was about an actual event of a couple of divers trying to identify a U-boat that they had found off the coast of North Carolina. There's another book called The Last Dive, which is a personal account by a diver of, again, on that particular wreck he was diving. He ended up getting decompression illness, and that was life-changing because he was actually disabled for a while because of that. And he wrote a book on it. And so there's a few like that. And then there's a fellow by the name of Andrew Main, who he's a journalist. He's done Shark Week episodes and all that, and he does some diving. So he put out a underwater investigations unit series, which I've read the first one of that so far. It's entertaining, but it's very, you've got the templates that the traditional publishing companies like to read, like to see, you know, and, you know, it's kind of just your average type of story. And I'm looking, and I know we all are, all of us independent authors, we're not writing to that. We're writing to what we want and what we think people will enjoy. And I think I've seen on social media, a lot of readers out there kind of getting tired of that same old thing coming out from the trad publishers, and they want to see something new. The problem is, how do we get our names into their Kindles or
exactly. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I know I've mentioned it. Is like, I mean, I've first started playing computer games in the 80s, and like some of my favorite games as a kid were like those text-only adventures, where it's almost like a digital choose your own adventure where they like narrate the story and you interact with it. And there's this company that made a ton of them, like famous ones like Zork and some of these other ones, but there was one called Cutthroats, and it was like you were a diver, and like these people hire you to like, these shady characters hire you to find like these shipwrecks and stuff. And I don't know, it was a game that stood out with me for like, because it was so different, that like I had that in the back of my mind when I first heard of you, and I'm like, oh, there's a book about like diving. Like, so I was like, I don't know, it was like this, it triggered something from my childhood that I'm like, oh, I gotta check this out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice to hear.
Yeah.